You're listening to episode 280 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Grace Schireson joins us to speak about her teacher, her new book, Zen Bridge, The Zen Teachings of Keido Fukushima. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax-deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. The relationship between student and teacher within Buddhism is not quite like the relationship one develops, or doesn't develop, with your math or economics teacher. It's deep. It's intense, heartwarming, sometimes heartbreaking. More often than not, it's that connection that can lead to tremendous insight and progress on the path. In the Zen tradition, I've found this to be particularly so, and our guest today shares about her late, beloved, and honored Roshi. Grace Schireson is Dharma heir in the Suzuki Roshi lineage, who has practiced Zen meditation for more than 35 years. She is trained in Soto Zen in America under Sojun Mel Weitzman Roshi of Berkeley Zen Center, and in Rinzai Zen in Japan under Keido Fukushima Roshi. She has taught Zen classes throughout the United States. She is trained as a clinical psychologist and is dedicated to teaching Asian methods of quieting the mind using techniques suitable for Westerners. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Gyokuro tea. And our guest today is Grace Schireson. Grace, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Hello.
It's so nice to see you again. For those who are listening, I do have a couple of links on the episode page for this episode. Grace has joined us now for the third time. It's always a delight to have her, but it's been a few years. It's been about 4 years. So we're going to jump right in and start asking about this new book and your old teacher, Keido Fukushima. He was your Roshi in Rinzai Zen in Japan. Tell us a story about how you first heard of him.
Well, I really believe in this kind of connectivity or karma or synchronicity. The first time I heard about him, I was sitting in a bath in Kyoto, a public bath, and the woman next to me asked me what I was doing there, and I told her that I practiced Zen, and that's why I was in Kyoto. She said, we have a wonderful resource here. And she said, Fukushima Roshi. I said, yes, I've met him, but he's Rinzai and I'm Soto. And that was the end of, the bath. I got out and dried off and never met him. But then the second time I read his name in a book about Zen temples that one could visit in Japan. And I saw his name there. The third time I was really ready to find a teacher, and I had asked Shohaku Okumura if I might be able to meet Uchiyama Roshi. So this was still in the 90s when he was around and still teaching. And Shohaku said, well, you need to call Tom Wright when you get to Kyoto, and he'll tell you whether he's accepting students. So when I got to Kyoto, I was able to reach Tom Wright, and he said, no, he's getting too old to take on students, and good for him, because that might have been just the sort of thing that could push him over the edge, obstructionist ways. So anyway, he said, Tom Wright said, why don't you try his friend, Fukushima Keido Roshi? He takes American students. So after hearing it the third time, I said, come on, someone's telling me I need to meet this man. So I called him, and I didn't know any of this. All I knew was he was a friend of Uchiyama Roshi's. I guess they went to university together. But I did not know that Fukushima Roshi came to the United States every year, met many, many American Zen students at universities, and invited them all to come to his temple for the shortcut to enlightenment. I didn't know this, but so I just called the temple and I said, well, my name is Grace, and I would like to meet Fukushima Roshi, or Keido Fukushima. I don't even know what I called him. I didn't realize, oh, this is a really important Roshi in Japan. And so they said, just a minute, because they assumed I was one of the Americans he had met on his trips. They put the phone right through to him. And I know I've talked to some Zen authors who've spent years in Japan and tried to set up meetings with him, and they've never gotten through. So anyway, they put me right through to him. He said hello. We discussed. I said, I really would like to find a temple to practice in Kyoto. And I'm a student. I was a student of Suzuki Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. And he said, oh, okay, well, why don't you meet me at my temple? I said, well, I know your temple is very, very large, so I'm not sure how I will find you. He said, oh, I'll send my car for you. So that night, my husband is looking out of our Japanese inn, and he sees the Japanese limo pull up, and a monk in full attire and geita getting out of the car. Says, oh, this is another thing you got me into. And we proceeded to go. And I was so literally knocked out by him the first meeting. I said, well, Joshu's alive and well, lives in Kyoto, and speaks English. Now, he didn't speak much English with us. He had a translator. He was kind of a trickster that way. He did speak better English than I spoke Japanese, but it meant I really worked on my conversational Japanese so I could be in the temple. And it turned out that I was correct about Joshu because he only lectured on Joshu. That was on the record of Joshu. That was the only thing he ever gave lectures on. So I felt that connection myself. Anyway, when my husband and I walked out of that meeting, both of us felt like we'd had the wind knocked out of us. It was like something had just happened. Whoa, the Roshiometer was off the scale. And I said, I need to come back here. And I did. And I came back for doing 7-day sesshin there. Usually I would come and spend some days in Kyoto before sort of adjusting jet lag and all, and then do the retreat, and then stay on another week or two to do Dokusan with him, because he did koan study, and that I could do after the session as well.
That's interesting. I'd perhaps forgotten that we had some commonalities. You mentioned Uchiyama Roshi and his Opening the Hand of Thought is one of my favorite books. And
yes.
Okamura Sensei was a preceptor at my Jukai. So it was nice to hear his name.
Yes. Well, he was, first I went to Blanche and she said, well, Okamura Sensei, or Okamura Roshi now, would be able to help you with that. So that's how I got connected. I think my partner gave me his phone number.
So you've made some references on this, and I wanted to unpack it a little bit, is this relationship between a student and teacher. And you and I have spoken about this before, is often quite profound, and I think especially in Zen. What was it like for you? How did that develop over time?
Well, I was really knocked out by him, and I didn't know how that worked, except that my first contact with Zen was through Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, and I had the same experience. Something that he said wouldn't leave me. It wasn't like I had the same physical experience. There's a book coming out about Ruth Fuller Sasaki and Sokean, And in that book, she talks about the powerful physical impact that he had in conveying the Dharmakaya to people around him, some complete sense of his entry into emptiness. I wouldn't know how to put words on the experience, but I know that they were both Rinzai teachers. And there's some very powerful integration, which I also experienced when I practiced Rinzai, more so than I did with Soto, because there's quite a demand that you perform very speedily physical tasks and you do them exactly right, or else. And so there's a way that body and mind come together in some very powerful energy channel. Well, for example, after the first session, which I went to by myself, and I told my husband, who was doing a practice period of Rinso-en in Soto tradition, Suzuki Roshi's home temple, I said, if I call you from Kyoto and say, I've twisted my ankle, you know you will find me in a luxury hotel in Kyoto, and I've washed out of sashimi. That it was just too much for me. So just wait for the code words and you'll know what's happening. Now, that didn't happen, but I did meet up with him in Kyoto after the retreat, and we decided to take a walk along the canal in Geisha District. And he reached out to hold hands with me, and I took his hand, and he screamed as if I were going to break his hand. Now, I'm not very strong. I have kind of skinny little joints here. And so there was something that happened later when we told Fukushima that story. He said, what's the shame? So there's something that happens with the physical energy of the body from that intense concentration. That was something that I know that things changed for me when I did Soto Zen Sesshin. For example, my ability to do aerobics, my ability to follow movement was improved. But this was different. This was a kind of power that was emanating. And that was a kind of power, a hundredfold that I experienced just in conversation with him, a kind of power. And that's what Ruth Fuller Sasaki describes about Sokeon as well. So there's something about doing the Rinzai practice that's very physical.
What did you admire most about him as you got to know him more and more?
Well, first of all, he was very warm and very charming when you weren't in Dokusan. So he would have you meet for a cup of tea. And he was such a charming man. And then he would use his really good English and talk about the things he loved about Americans and American life, Joan Baez and so on. So he was very down to earth, and he would make statements like, which we reflected a little bit in the book, I think Godiva chocolate is better than Satori. He was very charming and warm. And along with that, he was very caring. One night I showed up with some of my students who I'd brought over to meet him. And my husband, Peter, was not with us. And he said, so where's your husband? And I said, well, he has a cold tonight. And he looked at me and said, no, you need to take care of him. And I said, okay, I will. The tea and lemon and honey and all of those things, yes, I will do that before I left. So he was very warm that way about taking care of my husband as well as myself. So his teaching was very profound for me. I had, during the time that I was sitting with him, I had one of those arthroscopic knee surgeries. It's a sports injury from Zen that we wear out our knees. So I had that before now they don't do it anymore, but I had it, and I was going over to see him. I was going to bow. I said, you don't need to bow. For Dokusan, you bow several times before I'm all the way to the floor. He said, you don't need to bow. I said, no, I've had the surgery, my knee's good. And I started to bow. And he screamed at me, don't bow. And it was like, that was a teaching. There was a blasting teaching about you must take care of your body. By that time, he may have learned that he had Parkinson's. And so he was very attuned to, don't you push yourself when you're practicing with me in a way that's going to hurt you. So warm and caring part of him, the charming part of him, but also there was something that happened in the Dokusan itself. So we would be sitting, for 14, 16 hours a day. And then 4 to 5 times a day, we would have interviews. And I'd be working on my koan, and I'd come up with what I thought was a reasonable answer, something that I could say. Because actually, one time I went in there, and when he asked me about my koan, I said, I just bowed. And he looked at me and said, "That's your answer?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "No good." And it was funny because as I was sitting outside the Doksan room, I was thinking to myself, I think I'm just a no good Soto monk. I just have nothing to say here. So he echoed what had been in my head. He said, "No good." But so I had learned that wasn't going to pass. And I wasn't going to do well at all. So I always had something to say when I went to see him. And sometimes the answers would seem reasonably good. And I would present them, and he would shake his head and ring the bell. And in that few seconds of exchange, I would see what was wrong with my answer. And it's in my mind, it's mind to mind transmission. There was enough power that something was brightening my mind when I was in his physical presence. And I could see, oh, that's what's wrong with my answer. It's too much this or it's too much that. And I couldn't say how that worked, but it did. So he was a very powerful koan teacher, maybe the most powerful koan teacher on the planet, because I don't know of any others either in Japan or in China, and I especially don't know any that spoke English and worked with Western students, which he loved.
Well, let's stay on this theme then. If you could identify 2 or 3 things that you learned from Roshi that were the most helpful to you in your practice, what might they be?
Well, he was not shy about saying right and wrong. Sometimes I think Buddhists get very conflict averse. And, well, maybe it's a little of this and that. Who can say, right? It's in the middle somewhere. But he was very clear. That's no good. So I learned that that kind of perception. And one story that I tell in the book is an example of that, in which a man comes to Fukushima Temple and he wants to become a priest. And he asks the head monk while he's waiting for his interview with Fukushima what's going to happen. And the head monk says, well, the Roshi will ask you, your name and how old you are and what you do for a living and so on. So those are the kinds of questions he'll ask you. So the man went into the interview, and when Fukushima Roshi asked him, well, what do you do for work? He said, I'm a thief. And Roshi said, well, have you been in jail for your crimes? And he said, no. And so Roshi said, well, I can't make you a priest until you turn yourself into the police. And you serve your time. And then after that, if you come back, you can become a priest. I can't even imagine that happening with an American teacher. But that was his sense of right and wrong. There's a right way to do this. And even if it means you have to go to jail, there's a right way to do this. On the other hand, he was rather supportive. I remember hearing a story of one of the students, Western students, that he sponsored to come to study Zen in Japan. And he got involved with drugs and got arrested. Fukushima had to go bail him out and take responsibility for him, and he did. But he was very clear on these issues about what he believed was right and wrong. So that was very interesting to me. He had a profound knowledge of Buddhism. He had a PhD in Buddhism, as they get them in Japan at the universities there. And he was also a student of Shibayama Zenke Roshi, who was a very profound teacher of Zen, most well known for his commentary on the Mumonkan, a very well educated and sophisticated teacher. And he knew how. The third thing that was so important about him was that he knew how to work with Americans and he spoke English. He had spent at least a year at Claremont College. D.T. Suzuki came over as the first one who was invited, first Zen master who was invited to teach in the United States. And then after that, D.T. Suzuki, when he got too old, asked Shibayama Roshi. And then when Shibayama Roshi became too old, he asked Fukushima Roshi. So the way of teaching him how to teach in the United States was to have him spend a year at Claremont College and learn English and hang out with Americans. And so in the book, we tell the story of, how he is dressed as a Zen monk. And people will come up to him and say, you're a Zen monk, do you know martial arts and magic and so on? But he spent a lot of time with Westerners, and he really loved being able to teach Americans and spending time.
So in your book, what do you like best about it? What appeals to you most about it?
What appeals to me most is I'm a psychologist by profession as well as a Zen teacher. So he had a very down-to-earth psychological view without talking about theory. In one of the groups of students that I brought over to meet him, one of the students asked, what is the most important thing? And he said, watching your own mind. And that is it. That's the job, isn't it? On and off the cushion.
Yep.
What are you up to? Now what are you up to? So in one of the first stories that I read about his teaching, it was in a book about 20th century Zen masters and their calligraphy, a Stephen Addis book and Audrey So, and was this expression, look under your own feet, which is another version of this, watching your own mind. So this looking under your own feet, rather than, at least my tendency, I'm like a correction machine for other people. Every time I catch myself doing that, it's like coming back to me. Am I looking at what I'm doing now? So I thought that was a very profound teaching, as well as his view of how it worked to work together, teacher and the student. And one of his favorite teaching stories was the story of Joshu and his head monk, who later received transmission. And the monk came to him and said, what do you say to the one who has thrown it all away, who has let go of everything? Now what do you say? And he said, throw it away. And the monk said, I just told you, I threw it all away. So why are you asking me to throw it away? And he said, all right then, Joshu said, keep on carrying it. So I really see that as two sides of what we do, both from Zen and Vipassana. Particularly in Rinzai Zen, it's very active on the throw it away side, out of my mind, back to my koan. And the Soto side and even the Vipassana side is, to me, keep on carrying it, watching it, noting the feelings, sensations, and so on that are arising. So to me, that's a very good story that he repeated very well. If you can't throw it away, and oftentimes you cannot when you're thinking and rethinking, then how do you carry it? How do you keep carrying it in a way that you allow the mind to settle itself upon itself?
What else do you hope readers get from it? Certainly that, but what else?
Well, as I said, he was just such a down-to-earth person. And in one of the early chapters, I think it's Look Under Your Own Feet, he talks about his experience of being in the Osaka train station. Now, I've been in the Osaka train station. It's the only station I ever got lost in. And he was so mad at me because I was leading a group and it was impossible. So I couldn't find my way back. Anyway, he talks about being in the Osaka train station because he used to go to teach Zazen Kai in Osaka, so he would take the train. And the rushing about of this world that we're in, the rushing and rushing, he said he was standing still and watching it when a student bumped into him as he was standing still. And the student said something like, get out of my way, you shit monk. Now, in Japanese, the translation was bombs kuso or kuso bombs, which I think meant more like shithead. But anyway, we translated it at the request of our publishers as shit monk. So the student was essentially calling him a shithead. And he said to the student, wait a minute. And the student stopped and then looked at him and apologized and said, oh, I'm so sorry. He was a priest. And I'm so sorry I called you shit. And Fukushima Roshi, this is a very down-to-earth teaching, said, I don't care if you call me a shit. You have shit. I have shit. Everybody has shit. But you said, get out of my way, stop bumping into me. I was standing still. You bumped into me. And that's what I'm objecting to. And then he said the student stopped and looked at him and apologized again. He said, now, this is a very important point, and I think one many of us are encountering today about holding our ground and saying what's right and standing up for what's right and not saying, well, I'm a Buddhist, I don't take a political view. He said, you have to find your place and stand up, and it takes courage. So that's another one of his teachings that I really loved.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I see that happening a great deal too with, I first noticed this in criticisms of people of color retreats that, that's just, increasing divisiveness. Buddhism isn't about that. There's no self, and people really taking on the role of being emptier than thou. So I've
Yes, I do.
And not recognizing the pragmatic realities of, in this lifetime.
In this lifetime and in the history of Buddhism, it's the same thing with women. There are no women here. We're all like one thing. It's like, no, that's the going to the emptiness defense.
Yes, it is. It's a
no women, there are no men.
Right,
there are. If there are no women, then why is it that all of the patriarchs are men?
Or are they patriarchs? Yes.
We would see a mix of men and women if there was no discrimination or difficulties in becoming a Zen master. So
I think it's very hard sometimes. It certainly is on my side in seeing things like, white privilege, which I benefited from and recognize and see more and more as I learn more and practice more and open to that. But I'm also seeing this thing we're talking about right now, whether it's women or people of color or other forms of oppression that occur, that there's an excuse of the emptiness as a way to not have to engage with the complexities of what the world is like. And this teaching you're talking about is really touching on that directly.
Yes, it is. It's not spiritual bypassing.
Right, exactly.
Not engaging in spiritual bypassing. That's why it was so interesting to me that he said to this thief, you're going to have to turn yourself into the police if you're going to become a priest, because you have to start at the beginning with honesty, really. Right. And that's very unusual. That's really engaging in a way that has values, social values.
So there's a little bit of a teaser we can offer to the listeners as we were talking before we started recording the interview. There's something about the cover calligraphy and what's in the book. I'm wondering if you could describe that.
Well, when you see the book, the cover calligraphy is actually the calligraphy that Fukushima Roshi did, which appears throughout the book in the section, the various sections that we have in the book. And the cover calligraphy is his name. And his formal name comes from a Chinese poem, More Quietly Enter the Mountains. And as he taught me about his name, it was about how when you hear the sound of a bird in the mountains, you appreciate how truly quiet they are. So More Quietly Enter the Mountains was from the Chinese poem about this. So that's what's on the cover of the book. But what had happened was they got the calligraphy mixed up, and I noticed that they had put on the cover a different calligraphy, When the Heart is Clear, the 100 Tasks Go Well, which is in a different section of the book. And so in the page facing the title page, rather than putting Fukushima's name, they put When the Heart is Clear, the 100 Tasks Go Well. So it's not the same as the one on the cover. And for those of you who know a little bit about calligraphy, you'll notice that. So I wanted to tell potential readers what the calligraphy on the cover actually is. More Quietly Enter the Mountains. Fukushima Roshi's name as he wrote it.
Thank you. And just shifting a little bit, what are you working on now? You have something else that you're starting?
Yes, I have retired from many of my Sangha activities and passed my retreat center on to a Tibetan group who's doing retreats there, the one Empty Nest, and they're doing Tibetan retreats there now. And I do some teaching on Stanford campus for the Office of Religious Life and the Buddhist community at Stanford. And I also travel to see my granddaughter in New York, which is where I am right now. So I wanted to give myself time. I'm 71 this year. On December 8th, the day of the Buddha's enlightenment, will be my birthday, 71. And my mother and my grandmother died at 78. So I thought, well, I better get on it here. If that's it, I have no reason to know otherwise, but that's my family history. Mm-hmm. So I'm doing more writing. I'm working on a chapter for Edo Carney's book on facing challenges, I think, which is something we all can relate to right now in Buddhist America, the facing of challenges. And the other thing that I'm working on is a book just about my adventures in both Japan and also practicing in the West and teaching in the West. So the title of the book is called The Foot in the Air, and it comes from a story that Darlene Cohen told. Darlene Cohen Osho, or Dai Osho, because she deceased a few years back. She had rheumatoid arthritis, and she was very devoted to Zen, and she had an apartment very close to the Zen Center, and there were days when her arthritis would strike that she could not walk up the steps to the Zen Center. And so she would try, but she couldn't do it. She was having too much pain. So she would return home and meditate in her room, which she did. She said by following the movement of the light in her room, just laying still and watching that, or her breath. And eventually she learned how, when she was walking up the stairs, to put her attention on the foot in the air. And I think that's such a wonderful teaching, an application of Zen in a way that we can become so focused on painful circumstances. I call it clutching razor blades, that we don't know how to let that go and put our attention on the hand itself, open the hand of thought, as Uchiyama Roshi said. So I have another story in there about the time that I went to the Japanese baths, and it's called Too Much Mu. And I had been meditating on Mu for quite a few days, speaking of emptiness. And the way I meditated on Mu when I was at Tofukuji was pouring myself down the cracks in the slate tiles. And these were actually big hunks of slate, so there were cracks between them. And I didn't know how to do rinzai practice, so that's what I did. And women, there were very few women that ever practiced there, but we were allowed to go take a bath. The men weren't allowed to leave the temple. So I could run down the streets of Kyoto in my robes. I didn't have time to change. And I had shaved my head at that time. I had just been ordained. And I ran down to the baths, and I had my robes on. Of course, they recognized me as a Tofukuji monk. So they sent me to the men's side. However, I had been practicing Mu for so long, I knew something was wrong, just sort of sensed something was wrong, but I couldn't figure it out. Looking at the naked man, I knew something was wrong, but the concept could not come into my mind. You're on the men's side, and those are naked men, and by the way, you're a woman. That part I couldn't quite grok because I had been doing so much Mu. So I went back out and looked at the bath house attendant, and she waved me back in to the men's side. So I went back in and saw the naked men, and I said, no, this can't be right. So I went back out again, and she looked at me, and she said, oh, Nuggets, are you a woman? By the way, I had forgotten how to speak, never mind English or Japanese, so I couldn't find the words, but I was able to say, and nod my head. So I nodded my head, and she said, okay. She pointed to the women's side where I had been. I'd been to that bathhouse before, but she followed me in because she wanted to know when I undressed that I really was a woman. For them to believe with my height, about 5'10", and my shaved head and my robe, actually was a woman. So they all stood around and inspected me to make sure I was a woman, and had the comment afterwards, yes. And that was, what an awesome nun this is, because in so many ways compared to the women. And I would hear that when I would be walking down the streets of Kyoto in my little neighborhood, the Fukushima neighborhood. Oh, there's the Shibuya. So that's what the book is about my encounters with Japanese culture and how difficult it was for me to function there, and how humorous it was at times too.
Looking forward to that as well. So everyone, our guest today, welcoming back, and our conversation today with Grace Schireson. Grace, thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to speaking with you again, especially when that new book comes out too.
Zen, yes, this book is Zen Bridge, and that one will be The Foot in the Air. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.